The summer heat pressed down on the parking lot like a heavy blanket, making the asphalt shimmer in waves that blurred the lines between what was real and what was a mirage. Cars sat cooling in the blazing sun, their metal bodies ticking softly as engines settled into silence. The air hung thick with the smell of hot pavement, fried food from a nearby corner stand, and something else, tension that seemed to pulse through the atmosphere like electricity before a storm. Michael Jenkins pushed through the glass doors of the small corner grocery store, a single paper bag clutched in his weathered hand. Inside that simple brown bag were the basics of survival: a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a gallon of milk. Nothing fancy, nothing suspicious, just enough groceries to get him through the next couple of days, just enough to make the day feel productive and normal. At 42 years old, Michael had learned to navigate the world with careful steps. He worked maintenance at the local high school, spending his days fixing broken light fixtures, wrestling with faulty wiring, and dealing with toilets that never quite stopped running. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the rent and kept food on his table. More importantly, it kept him invisible, and in his neighborhood, invisibility was often the difference between safety and danger. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, words she'd spoken to him countless times when he was younger and full of questions about why the world seemed to watch him more carefully than others. "Just buy your milk and go home, baby," she used to say, her eyes carrying the weight of generations of hard-learned wisdom. "Don't give them any reason to notice you." Those words had stuck with him through the years, becoming a survival strategy he'd never consciously chosen but had absorbed like breathing. Michael adjusted the bag carefully, making sure not to crush the eggs nestled inside. His keys were already in his hand, always prepared, always thinking ahead. The plan was beautifully simple: groceries, home, dinner, invisibility. Stay safe. Stay alive. Don't become another statistic, another hashtag, another name that trends for 3 days before the world moves on to the next tragedy. His modest gray sedan waited under a flickering streetlight that seemed unable to decide whether to live or die. The light blinked erratically, casting dancing shadows across the cracked pavement. He was maybe 5 steps away from his car, 5 steps from safety, when he saw them. The patrol car sat slanted across 2 faded parking spaces like the officers inside didn't believe rules applied to them. 2 white men in their mid-40s occupied the front seats, one thick-necked and broad-shouldered like a linebacker gone soft, the other wiry and pale with sunburned cheeks and an impatient jaw that seemed permanently clenched in irritation. Their windows were cracked open just enough to let their radio chatter spill into the summer air, a constant stream of dispatcher codes and static that sounded like the mechanical heartbeat of authority. One of them wore mirrored sunglasses, the kind that didn't just reflect light but seemed to swallow it entirely, hiding any trace of humanity behind their silver surface. Michael felt their attention lock onto him like radar, but he didn't flinch. Years of practice had taught him the art of moving naturally, of not appearing threatening or suspicious. He kept his pace steady, keys in hand, one foot in front of the other, projecting the calm confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was. He reached his car without incident, popped the trunk with a soft click, and gently placed the bag inside. The milk settled on top of the bread with a soft thud, while the eggs found their place beside them, cushioned and safe. For just a moment, Michael allowed himself to exhale, thinking he'd made it through another ordinary day without incident. In 3 minutes, he'd be driving home. In 20 minutes, he'd be sitting at his kitchen table, safe and invisible once again. That's when the voice cracked through the air like a whip. "So." The word hung in the summer heat like a blade waiting to fall. Michael turned slowly, his heart already beginning to race despite his outward calm. The larger officer was now standing outside their cruiser, his hand resting casually on his belt, a belt crowded with tools designed to control and subdue. "Step away from the vehicle," the officer commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience without question or explanation. Michael's throat felt suddenly dry. "What's this about?" he asked, keeping his voice level and respectful, the way his mother had taught him, the way survival demanded. "This area's had reports of theft," the cop replied, his hand adjusting something on his belt with practiced ease. "You match a description." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. What description? He wanted to ask, but deep down, he already knew the answer. He'd always known the answer. In this moment, Standing in a parking lot with a bag of groceries and a receipt in his pocket, he understood with crystal clarity that his skin had become his crime, his presence had become his threat, and his very existence had become their justification for whatever came next. The wiry officer was already moving, sliding out of the patrol car with the fluid motion of a predator that had found its prey. His pale skin was flushed red from the heat, but his eyes were cold and calculating as they fixed on Michael with laser focus. Black male, 20 to 40, athletic build, loitering near parked vehicles. He recited like he was reading from a script written specifically for this moment. Michael felt a bitter laugh bubble up from his chest, but he swallowed it down before it could escape. So that was a description. Him, his skin, his gender, his approximate age, and the crime of existing in public space. He was every black man who had ever walked through this parking lot, every person who had ever made these officers uncomfortable simply by breathing the same air. "I got a receipt," Michael said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. "Groceries. You want to see it." But the younger officer was already too close, his face twisted with an expression that Michael had seen before, the look of someone who had already decided how this story would end. "You're acting nervous," the cop snapped, taking another step forward until Michael could smell the coffee on his breath and see the sweat stains under his arms. "Am I?" Michael asked, genuinely confused. His voice was calm, his hands were visible, his posture was non-threatening. But apparently, in their eyes, his mere presence was an act of aggression worthy of escalation. The question hung in the air for less than a second before everything exploded into chaos. The younger officer's hand shot out and grabbed Michael's wrist with a grip that felt like a steel vise. Before Michael could even process what was happening, he was spun around and slammed face first into the hood of his own car with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. The paper bag burst on impact, its contents scattering across the pavement in a grotesque display of waste and humiliation. A bottle of apple juice rolled into the gutter, its label already beginning to peel in the heat. The carton of milk tipped over, creating a white stream that flowed between the cracks in the asphalt like spilled blood. The eggs cracked loudly, their shells breaking against the concrete with wet, final sounds that seemed to echo Michael's own breaking spirit. "Hey!" Michael shouted, his voice muffled against the burning metal of his car hood. The surface was scalding from hours in the direct sun, and he could feel his cheek beginning to blister where it pressed against the metal. "I'm not resisting." "Stop moving," the older cop barked, as if Michael had suddenly broken into some kind of violent dance rather than simply trying to breathe while being crushed against his own vehicle. A crowd was beginning to gather at the edges of the parking lot, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. A woman in hospital scrubs stood frozen, her phone halfway to her ear as if she couldn't decide whether to call for help or start recording. A man in work clothes leaned against his truck, shaking his head and muttering something about minding his own business. Another bystander actually laughed, a sound so muffled by the thick summer air that it seemed to come from underwater. But no one moved closer. No one spoke up. No one intervened. Michael's face pressed harder against the hood as his wrist scraped against the rough edge of the metal. He tried to focus on breathing, tried to remain calm, tried not to think about all the videos he'd seen, all the names that had trended online before being forgotten in the endless cycle of digital outrage and manufactured amnesia. One of the cops jabbed a finger at him, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think we don't know what's going on? You people always think you're smarter than the system. You people." Michael hissed through clenched teeth, his calm finally beginning to crack. The phrase hit him like a slap, reducing him from an individual human being to a representative of every stereotype, every prejudice, every fear these men carried in their hearts. "You want to make this difficult," the younger one growled, pressing his knee into Michael's back with enough force to make his ribs ache. "You already did," Michael snapped back, his voice gaining strength even as his body was being crushed. "You saw me and decided I was guilty." That's when the older officer's hand moved to his weapon. The sound of metal sliding against leather was unmistakable, a whisper that spoke volumes about how quickly a routine grocery run could transform into a life-or-death situation. Michael felt the cold press of the gun barrel against the side of his head, and suddenly the world became very small and very quiet. "Stop resisting," the officer said, but his voice sounded distant now, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. Michael's voice cracked when he spoke, all pretense of calm finally abandoning him. I'm not resisting." Then, louder, desperately, someone film this, please. The crowd remained frozen, phones hovering shakily in uncertain hands. A few cameras pointed in their direction, but nobody stepped closer, nobody spoke up, nobody wanted to become part of a story that was clearly spiraling toward tragedy. And then, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk, came a voice that changed everything. "Let him go." The words weren't shouted or screamed. They were spoken with a kind of calm authority that makes people stop and listen, the kind of voice that carries weight not because of its volume but because of the absolute certainty behind it. The officers turned, and Michael managed to crane his neck just enough to see a man standing at the edge of the scene. He was tall and built like a wall, wearing a simple green t-shirt soaked with sweat and denim shorts that had seen better days. No badge, no uniform, no official authority, just presence that seemed to fill the entire parking lot. The older cop narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening on the weapon still pressed against Michael's head. "This doesn't concern you," he snarled, but there was something in his voice now, uncertainty, maybe even fear. The man in the green shirt took one deliberate step forward, his movement controlled and purposeful. "It does now." "Who the hell are you?" the wiry officer demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his own weapon. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood there with the kind of stillness that comes before lightning strikes, his eyes moving between Michael's prone form and the two officers with calculated precision. Even through the sweat and fear, even with his face pressed against scalding metal, Michael found something familiar about that face. A whisper began to ripple through the crowd like wildfire. "That's John Cena." A teenager gasped, his phone automatically shifting to record mode. An old man sitting in a folding chair under a nearby awning muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." The wiry officer let out a snort of disbelief. "You think you're going to play hero?" His voice was filled with a kind of cocky confidence that comes from having a badge and backup. "Bad move." What happened next unfolded in seconds that felt like hours. The officer lunged forward with his right hand extended, clearly intending to grab Cena and show him what happened to civilians who interfered with police business. But John Cena had spent years in rings where split-second timing meant the difference between victory and devastating defeat. He sidestepped with fluid grace, one hand catching the incoming wrist in a grip that looked almost gentle. Then he twisted, not violently, not with unnecessary force, but with a precise application of leverage and anatomy that every professional wrestler learns in their first month of training. The officer's forward momentum worked against him, and suddenly he was spinning through the air before crumpling to the ground with a scream that cut through the summer heat like a knife. The wiry cop lay on the asphalt, clutching his forearm and making sounds that were somewhere between rage and agony. His face had gone from sunburned red to paper white in the span of a heartbeat, and sweat was beading on his forehead as he tried to process what had just happened. The older officer immediately raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Cena's chest. "You just assaulted a police officer," he screamed, but his voice was shaking now, the authority beginning to leak out of it like air from a punctured tire. John Cena didn't flinch. He didn't step back, didn't raise his hands, didn't show even a flicker of the fear that any reasonable person would feel when staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Instead, he looked directly into the officer's eyes and said, "Go ahead. You really want to be the guy who pulled a gun on John Cena in front of 24 witnesses." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and a warning rolled into one. Around them, the crowd had grown larger and more engaged. Phones were no longer hidden or hesitant. They were pointed directly at the scene, recording every second, every word, every breath. The age of social media had turned every bystander into a potential journalist, and everyone present understood that this moment was going to live forever in the digital consciousness of the world. The officer with the gun hesitated, his weapon wavering slightly as the full implications of his situation began to dawn on him. His partner was writhing on the ground. His own authority had been challenged and found wanting, and now he was pointing a weapon at one of the most recognizable faces in America while surrounded by cameras that would ensure his actions were broadcast to millions. Cena pointed at Michael, who was still pressed against the car hood, hardly daring to breathe. "He had a grocery bag and a receipt," John said, his voice carrying across the parking lot with perfect clarity. "You drew a weapon. Let's try that again. Let him go." The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade into silence as everyone waited to see which way this moment would tip. Would authority prevail through force and fear, as it had so many times before? Or would something different happen here, in this parking lot, under this flickering streetlight, witnessed by these cameras that would ensure the truth couldn't be buried or forgotten? The officer stared at John Cena for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his weapon. "Get up," he muttered to Michael, but the command lacked any of its previous bite. It sounded more like a request, maybe even a plea. John Cena moved forward with careful steps, extending one steady hand to help Michael stand. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gentle now, concerned. Michael nodded shakily, still not quite believing what had just happened. "I think so," he managed to whisper. John bent down and picked up the receipt that had fallen during the struggle. It was crumpled now, stained with milk and slightly torn, but still clearly legible. He held it up so the entire crowd could see it, his voice carrying across the parking lot with the authority of absolute truth. "This," he announced, "is what you get arrested for now." Somewhere in the crowd, a camera shutter clicked with digital precision. "Got it all on video," another voice called out. The mood in the parking lot shifted like weather changing. The stillness broke apart as the crowd began to move forward, not in a rush, not aggressively, but with deliberate purpose. Phones lifted higher, voices grew sharper, eyes narrowed with newfound understanding. The balance of power, which had seemed so fixed just a moment before, was suddenly fluid and dangerous. John turned back to the officers, both of whom looked like they were beginning to understand that they had stumbled into something much larger than a routine stop. "Today," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment, "you taught everyone watching a lesson, but it's not the one you meant to teach." And somewhere in the distance, growing louder by the second, came the rising wail of sirens screaming toward a scene that had already changed the course of multiple lives forever. The sirens grew louder, slicing through the thick summer air like blades cutting through fabric. Tires screeched against pavement as two more patrol cruisers whipped into the parking lot, their headlights flashing even in the daylight, engines rumbling with the urgency of cavalry arriving to save a battle that had already been lost. But they were too late. The damage was done, the moment had passed, and the truth was already spreading through social media faster than any official response could contain it. The original officers stood like statues caught in headlights, one still cradling his twisted wrist against his chest, whimpering softly as sweat beaded on his pale forehead, the other staring at John Cena like he was witnessing something impossible, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about how these situations were supposed to unfold. Michael remained close to Cena's side, still catching his breath, his face flushed and marked with a red welt from where it had been pressed against the scalding car hood. The groceries lay scattered around him like evidence of a crime that never was, broken egg creating abstract patterns on the asphalt, milk slowly evaporating in the heat, the apple juice bottle still rolling lazily toward the gutter. 3 new officers stepped out of the arriving cruisers, their hands hovering near their holsters, eyes darting between the scene, the crowd, and the man who now stood protectively between Michael and any further abuse. The lead officer, clearly the ranking member of this growing assembly, started barking orders with a kind of automatic authority that expects immediate compliance. "Everyone step back. This is an active situation." John Cena raised one hand, palm open, his gesture somehow both calming and commanding. "You're late," he said simply. The officer blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the response. "Excuse me." John didn't back down, didn't defer to the badge or the uniform or the supposed authority they represented. Instead, he pointed at Michael with deliberate precision. This man had a bag of groceries and a receipt. 2 of your officers tackled him, drew a weapon, and slammed him into a car. You want to control the scene? Start with controlling your own men. The lead officer approached cautiously, his training warring with the reality of who he was dealing with. John Cena wasn't just any civilian. He was a public figure, a man whose face was recognized by millions, whose every action in this moment was being recorded and would soon be analyzed by countless viewers around the world. "Who exactly are you?" the officer asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "You really don't know?" John asked, not with arrogance or smugness, just with a tired recognition of someone who understood that fame could be both a shield and a weapon. One of the junior officers leaned in and whispered something urgently in the lead officer's ear. The change in the man's demeanor was instant and dramatic. His posture stiffened. His tone shifted. His entire approach recalibrated itself in real time. "Mr. Cena," he said, now speaking with the overly polite tone reserved for people who could destroy careers with a single tweet. "Understood. We'll take it from here." "No," John said flatly, his voice cutting through the false courtesy like a sword through silk. "You're not sweeping this under the rug. Not while these people are watching. Not while this man's groceries are still leaking into your parking lot." Michael stood straighter at those words, drawing strength from the way John refused to let his dignity be minimized or forgotten. The white trail of milk near his feet had turned sticky in the heat, creating a path that told the story of an ordinary day turned into a nightmare by prejudice and badge-powered arrogance. "They had a gun to my head," Michael said, his voice stronger now though still shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline. "I told them I had a receipt. They didn't care." John nodded, then turned his attention back to the lead officer. His voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. "Two of your officers assaulted an innocent man. He didn't yell. He didn't resist. He cooperated completely. And you met him with force." The older cop, the one who had pressed a gun to Michael's head, suddenly spoke up, his voice defensive and shrill. "He matched the description. He was acting suspicious." John took a slow step forward, and everyone in the parking lot could feel the temperature drop despite the blazing sun. What description was that? Milk? Eggs? Clean shirt? Or just his skin? The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of quiet that comes when truth cuts through lies so cleanly that even the liars can't pretend anymore. The crowd, which had been hesitant and uncertain earlier, now began to murmur loudly, their voices building into something that sounded dangerous and justified. Some people moved closer, phones zoomed in for better angles, and several bystanders started streaming live to social media platforms where thousands of viewers were already sharing, commenting, and spreading the story faster than any news organization could respond. "This is going viral already," someone whispered, and everyone present understood that this moment had just transcended its local boundaries and become part of a much larger national conversation about justice, race, and the abuse of power. The younger cop still sat on the ground, cradling his arm, his eyes wide with pain and something that looked like genuine fear. Whatever training he'd received at the police academy hadn't prepared him for being disarmed by a civilian in a T-shirt, and it certainly hadn't prepared him for being disarmed by John Cena while surrounded by cameras that would ensure his humiliation lived forever on the internet. "Mr. Cena," the lead officer said again, his tone now completely transformed into something that bordered on pleading. "Please, let us handle this situation." "You lost the right to handle anything the second your officers treated a man like a suspect just for buying groceries," John replied. "You want control? Start by taking accountability." A black SUV pulled up to the scene, sleek and official-looking, with tinted windows that suggested important people were inside. A man stepped out wearing an expensive suit and a badge clipped to his belt. He walked with a confident stride of someone who had already seen the video footage, someone who knew he was arriving after the damage had been done, but hoping he could still control how the story would be told. He stopped cold when he saw John Cena standing protectively beside Michael. "Mr. Cena," he said, adjusting his tie nervously. "I'm Captain Ruiz. I saw the live feed. We're going to take this very seriously." John crossed his arms, his stance now clearly that of a man who had heard promises before and found them wanting. Two people could have died today. One had a receipt. The other had a badge. Guess which one pulled a gun? Captain Ruiz's jaw tensed as the full implications of the situation began to settle on him like a heavy weight. He turned and motioned sharply to one of the lieutenants standing nearby. "Relieve those officers. Now." Two uniformed cops stepped forward with handcuffs, and the original aggressors suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of the law they had claimed to represent. One of them started to protest, but the murmurs from the crowd surged into something louder and more threatening. "If they walk, we'll riot," someone shouted, and the sentiment was immediately echoed by a dozen other voices. The handcuffs clicked into place with metallic finality, and a wave of cheers rolled through the assembled bystanders. Justice, it seemed, could still sometimes find its way to the surface, even in a system designed to protect those who abuse their power. The police station buzzed with nervous energy as John Cena and Michael Jenkins sat side by side in uncomfortable plastic chairs that seemed designed more for punishment than for waiting. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows across walls that had witnessed countless confessions, interrogations, and moments where lives were forever altered by the decisions of others. Captain Ruiz paced behind a glass partition, his phone pressed at his ear, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to what were undoubtedly very important people who were very unhappy about having their evening disrupted by a viral video that was already reshaping public opinion in real time. Every few seconds, he glanced at John Cena like he was watching a bomb with an unpredictable timer. Michael sat stiffly, his hands folded in his lap, still processing the surreal turn his life had taken in the span of less than 2 hours. This morning he had been invisible, anonymous, just another working man trying to get through another ordinary day. Now he was sitting in a police station next to one of the most famous people in America, having survived an encounter that could have easily ended with his death, waiting to give testimony that would likely be dissected by millions of people across the country. "You okay?" John asked quietly, his voice carrying the same protective tone it had maintained since he first stepped into the parking lot chaos. Michael nodded, then shook his head, then shrugged with the kind of confused honesty that comes after trauma. "I thought I was, but now, being here, it feels like I'm back on that pavement." John was silent for a moment, understanding that some wounds couldn't be healed with words or gestures, that some experiences carved themselves so deeply into memory that they became permanent residents of the soul. "That's by design," he finally said. "These walls are built to remind you that you don't belong here, that you're always one word away from being considered a threat." Michael turned to look at him with genuine curiosity. "How do you know that?" John stared straight ahead, his eyes focused on something beyond the immediate present. "Because I've walked into rooms like this, and I've seen too many people not walk out." Before Michael could respond, Captain Ruiz emerged from his office, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes revealing the strain of a man trying to manage a situation that had already spiraled far beyond his ability to contain it. "We're ready for both of you," he announced, leading them toward a small interrogation room where a woman in a dark blazer sat waiting with sharp eyes and an even sharper pen. "I'm with Internal Affairs," she explained as they settled into metal chairs that somehow managed to be even less comfortable than those in the waiting area. "We'll be recording this conversation for legal and administrative purposes." The questions came systematically, professionally, each one designed to build a comprehensive record of exactly what had transpired and why. Michael walked through his story again, his voice gaining strength with each retelling, as if the act of speaking truth aloud was slowly transforming him from victim back into human being. When he reached the moment the officer had said, "You people," the Internal Affairs investigator's pen paused, and something shifted in her expression. When he described the gun pressed against his head, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did they ask for identification?" she asked. "Give any clear reason for the stop?" "They said I matched the description," Michael replied, his voice steady now. "But when I asked what description, they got more aggressive. I had the receipt in my hand, offered to show it multiple times. They didn't want evidence. They wanted compliance." She turned her attention to John. "And you intervened." "After I saw 2 armed men abusing someone over groceries," John replied without hesitation. "Did you apply force?" "I deflected an attempted assault and redirected aggressive action. I didn't attack anyone. I responded to protect someone who was being harmed by people who were supposed to serve and protect him." The room fell quiet as she made notes, the scratching of her pen the only sound in the sterile space. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable but her voice carrying weight. "There are at least 11 videos online now. One shows the weapon being drawn clearly. Do you believe their actions were racially motivated?" John didn't hesitate. "You don't need my belief. You have the footage." Michael leaned forward, his voice soft but carrying the weight of lived experience. "They didn't see a man buying groceries. They saw a problem that needed to be solved with force." The investigator leaned back in her chair, studying both men with eyes that had seen too many cases where justice got lost in bureaucracy and political calculations. "This is under investigation. There will be consequences." John stood slowly, his presence filling the small room. "Good. But don't make this a lesson about paperwork. Make it a lesson about people." 3 weeks later, Michael Jenkins stood at the podium in City Hall, looking out at a packed auditorium filled with faces that represented every corner of his community. The room buzzed with the kind of energy that comes when people gather around a moment that matters, when individual stories connect with universal truths about dignity and justice, and the courage required to stand up when standing up feels impossible. He had never wanted to be a speaker, never imagined himself as a kind of person who addresses crowds or gives interviews or becomes part of movements larger than himself. But life, he had learned, rarely asked permission before thrusting people into roles they never auditioned for. "I wasn't going to speak tonight," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone to every corner of the room. "I didn't think I had the right words. I still don't. But I know how it feels to have a gun pressed to your head for buying milk." The silence that followed was complete and profound, the kind of quiet that comes when truth cuts through noise so cleanly that even breathing seems too loud. "They didn't want proof," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "They wanted submission. They didn't see a customer. They didn't see a human being. They saw a target." As he spoke, Michael could see John Cena sitting in the front row, listening intently, his presence a reminder that sometimes heroes don't wear capes or carry badges. Sometimes they just refuse to walk away when someone else is being crushed. "I'm not here because I want attention," Michael said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who has survived something that could have destroyed him. "I want change. I want to live in a city where buying milk doesn't get you a gun to the face, where my nephew doesn't ask me if the cops will kill him for wearing a hoodie, where silence isn't the safest option." The applause that followed started small, then built into something powerful and sustained. People stood, not because they were told to, but because they recognized themselves in his story, because they understood that this moment was about more than one man's groceries or one celebrity's intervention. It was about the kind of world they wanted to live in and the courage required to build it. Outside the auditorium, under a sky full of stars that seemed brighter than usual, John and Michael stood together on the steps, watching people stream out into the night, their conversations animated and purposeful. "You think this changes anything?" Michael asked. John looked toward the city skyline, its lights twinkling like earthbound constellations. "I think people needed to see that someone could stand up and survive it. Now they have." A week later, Michael returned to the same grocery store, carrying the same simple shopping list, walking across the same parking lot where his life had nearly ended. But everything was different now. The spray-painted message on the wall read, "Justice doesn't show up on its own. It starts with people who refuse to stand still." As he placed his groceries in the trunk, a beat-up pickup truck rolled slowly through the lot. John Cena sat behind the wheel. No fanfare, no announcement, just quietly making sure that this time, Michael's ordinary day stayed ordinary. Their eyes met for just a moment. John nodded once, small, sure, and full of the understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in arenas or on stages, but in parking lots where heroes refuse to let injustice have the final word. Michael drove home in silence, his phone buzzing with messages he chose not to read, his heart finally free of the weight it had carried for too long. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens and headlines. Sometimes it comes disguised as a man in a green t-shirt who simply refuses to walk away when someone else needs saving. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.